Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to RightsCon. If this is your first session, welcome, welcome. It is toward the end of the conference, so it may be one of your later sessions. If it is, I hope you've been having an incredible conference. I know I have. My name is Vanessa Paik. I am the founder and director of Australian Community Managers, and I'm your host for this session for the next hour, which is entitled, Can Community Managers Save the World? It's a very ambitious title, but what it aims to do is to bring together online community professionals, because that role is being increasingly professionalised around the world, to have a conversation about how our work and practices intersect with the work of activists and human rights specialists around the world, how the tools and techniques that we use can add value and help you in your work, and how we can introduce you to perhaps more privacy-sensitive platforms than some of these social technologies that you may be more accustomed to using. In short, we'd like this to be the beginning of a conversation between professional community managers and the human rights community, and we think that there's a lot that we can learn from each other. We are also very much here to learn. We are humbled by the work that most of you do, and really sit in awe of your own communities and your own practices. So we are very much here to actively listen and learn from your experiences and have them inform our work. Before I go further, I would like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nations, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work here in Australia, and where I host this conversation from today. I pay my respects, and I invite you to pay yours to these local people for having allowed us to gather on their land, and to their elders past, present, and emerging. We have a great deal to learn from these communities. Just briefly, I wanted to introduce Australian Community Managers. We are the national centre in Australia for online community training, resources and career development. Our mission is to empower the growth of thriving and healthy online communities. So I'd like our panellists to very briefly introduce themselves and tell you where in the world they are and a tiny bit about their work and how it relates to today's panel. Let's start with Rebecca. Oh, you're on mute. Don't forget to unmute.
Yeah. I can't believe I did that. Hi, I'm Rebecca Newton. I'm in North Carolina. I'm the head of trust and community at superawesome.com, which is based around the globe, but also based originally in London. And this is my 1980s, I started working with the web with the U.S. government, and then the commercial web in the early 90s. So this is about my 27th year working in online communities, and I now basically work with children, people under 12, and have been for about 15 years or so.
Awesome. Thanks, Rebecca. Carrie?
All right, am I unmuted? Okay, wonderful. I am Carrie Melissa Jones. I am in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I am a community builder and consultant. I'm also the co-author of the book, Building Brand Communities. I have been building online communities for about the last 15 years and also study and research online communities at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So I will be bringing a lens on from both the research perspective as well as practitioner perspective, working with nonprofits, foundations, and for-profit organizations around the world.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carrie. Shreyas.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shreyas. I'm based in Bangalore, India. I've been building communities in tech and specifically in open source world for about 5 years now. I've also been contributing to several open source projects like Mozilla Wikimedia for about 9 years. And I'm part of the Mozilla Internet Health Report team. We bring in conversations about internet health and digital rights. Really interested in this whole conversation about digital rights and building an open web, and extremely honored to be here on this panel with this amazing bunch of people.
Thanks, Shreyas. We're honored to have you. And the lovely Dr. Lauren Vargas.
Hello. Yes, Dr. Lauren Vargas. I am an independent researcher and consultant. So I have my own consultancy practice called Your Digital Tattoo. And I'm the independent researcher associated with the UK project called One by One. It's with the University of Leicester, building digitally confident museums. I primarily work with organizations and regulated industries on communities for the last 18 years, and now work primarily with cultural organizations in building communities.
Fantastic. And as for myself, I've, similar to Carrie and Rebecca, been building online communities for about 20 years or so across a very wide sort of a broad church of industries, civil society, government, corporate, private industry, startups, and everything in between. And I've also moved into the research space as well. So I'm doing my PhD at the moment in artificial intelligence, algorithmic governance and online communities, and looking at how machine culture is impacting the way we convene groups of people online and how that might conflict with the social and communal logics and objectives that we're trying to achieve. So that's my research space. So those are our perspectives that we're bringing to the conversation today. We thought that we'd kick off with an introductory question because I was honoured to attend RightsCon a couple of years ago in Tunisia, and it blew my mind. And I went around and introduced myself to people, and most of them didn't really know what an online community manager was. So I thought it might be good to, it is, despite having been around for a little while, it is still relatively nascent, and certainly its professionalisation is still relatively nascent. We were just chatting before. There's around about 5,000 professional community managers in Australia, a few thousand in the UK, maybe about 20,000 or so in the US, and a handful of 1,000 in India as well, as far as we know. We don't even have an accurate view on the snapshot of this profession yet. It is still very nascent. However, it is growing, and particularly in the COVID-19 landscape, a lot of people have rushed to build or rapidly create and convene an online community to meet their objectives, whether they're commercial objectives or activist objectives or anything in between. So we see a blazing future for this industry. So if I could start with you, perhaps, Carrie, how would you frame online community management? What is it?
I would start by framing it as the practice of building meaningful relationships. We can sometimes get really into the tech, but really what we're talking about is about relationship building, because that's how we get to impact over time, is through the relationships that we build. And from an industry view, like you said, Vanessa, we really don't know how many people do this work, which is makes it really hard to advocate. And that's by design. Researcher Sarah T. Roberts writes about this with moderation specifically. So there's paid community managers, and then there's volunteer community managers. And paid community managers can be full-time in-house workers, part-time employees. They can be contracted through an agency, or they can themselves be contractors who work freelance. So there's a wide array of people that do this work, and the job title it's been co-opted in many, many different ways over the years. So there's different kinds of community managers, but ultimately it's about building relationships to me.
Yeah, that's great. I concur. Lauren, do you want to add your view here? How would you frame the discipline and its sometimes frustrating ambiguity?
Well, I would definitely echo it's all about relationship building. And as far as who does it, I think we can get wrapped up in the title, and we just have to recognize that somebody has to be there to enable, to support, to guide the community. If nobody is responsible or accountable, then the community cannot exist. So there does need to be some structure, but don't get hung up on having the right title or the perfect role or having, already, expertise from other places. It's about finding the right person at the right time, or the right people at the right time, to steward that safe space, to have those interactions wherever they might be.
Yeah, beautifully put. Shreyas, how would you frame it from your view?
Sure. I think definitely agree with Carrie and Lauren there with their views about how ambiguous this is. I mean, this is a struggle across the industry. It's very evident that the struggle is across the industry because we are all from like different parts of the world, and yet we sort of say the same thing. And just like extend on Lauren's point, right, which is these are essentially facilitators who build connections. So you have this popular phrase, which is, if you build, they will come, which is not true in the community world. They will not come. They rarely come. So I think the people who do this, yeah, it's a myth. It's absolutely a myth. So the people who, I think, craft these experiences and make it welcome and engage with these people, I think they are the community builders, community managers, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, I totally agree. Glad that you pointed that out. There is also, I think, that sense that I know some people can get concerned or anxious if we say, the word community manager. A lot of people want to say, but you shouldn't manage a community. That feels very, authoritarian and hierarchical, and it does. It has that baggage on that word. But despite popular belief, communities really don't manage themselves, at least not usually when they start out. They can certainly reach a point of self-organisation and governance, and particularly if they're bound by a very strong animating cause and endeavour. But it is really important to have that personal group of people that have some shared oversight over the stewardship of that group and its objectives. Rebecca, what are your views on this point?
I'm going to take a viewpoint of what community managers are not, rather than what they are, since everybody else has explained very well what they are. But they're not police, they're not law enforcement, they're not moms or nans or grandmothers, looking over your shoulder and telling you how to behave. I think, in my experience, that they're people who facilitate taking a group of people, whether that's 50 or 50,000, and helping them foster a sense of belonging, but as also of sharing common interests, right? Usually that's where communities grow, out of a sense of common interest. So it's really about, from my perspective, watching something organic happen and being the sort of gardener of that, whatever that organic thing is, and whether it's a community of dentists or a community of activists or, of kids. In my case, I work a lot with kids, and they have all their own communities. So it's sort of watching groups organize, fostering that, encouraging that, and I think being a cheerleader is sort of, and a person who likes to network people with each other and build things is really essential to the job. So that's my perspective.
Yeah, great. I think beautifully captured by everybody. And I think something I'm fairly confident we'd all agree with is that ultimately the work is deeply contextual. What a community builder or manager is to a community of developers is quite different to what a community manager is to a community of activists or a community of community managers or a community of accountants who have a community of practice. It is very bound by context. The way I say it is, the way I describe it is our job is to steer purpose and shared value. So really to keep our eye on the ultimate purpose that is the binding element, the reason we're all here, our sort of common why, which does iterate and evolve, and the shared value, which is very important. And I think striving for a balance in that, so that and is something we do find ourselves doing a lot, particularly if we are working for private companies who are interested in building communities. We are a intermediary between those two groups. We see ourselves as representative of our community constituents. And while we are working for those employers in some instances, we are very mindful to make sure that that group is managed ethically and non-coercively and non-exploitatively. So we already do tend to bring those sort of duty of care elements to our work. So purpose and shared value are the main things. We have a question from the group, which, if it's okay, I might tackle later, because it seems like a really great way to end, which is to get your book and further resource recommendations. And I have a ton, I'm sure you do as well. So we can definitely give you some great reading and follow-up resources. And we've got a collaborative challenge for you as well at the end. So if that's all right, I just wanted to move on and ask one of the core questions of this panel, which is, so, we sit on these digital front lines for businesses, civic groups, all sorts of organizations. We are often an unseen intermediary between the platforms, government and organizations and the users. We are often the meat in the sandwich there, negotiating relationships, sometimes mopping up damage from platforms, reconciling those issues within our own communities, and trying to build the right kind of bridges between all those stakeholder groups in a way that generates that shared value. How can we in our work, even if we're not working directly in the human rights space, how can we be allies for the work of those attending RightsCon? Shreyas, do you want to kick off?
Sure. I think it starts with being aware of the issues and injustice that's happening around the community that you're really interacting with, and more often than not, community managers inherently have this skill of storytelling. So can you then tell this story in a more efficient way so that you can develop a sense of empathy among the people that you're interacting with? I think that would be an interesting point. And I think some very tangible outcomes would be, can you help them make a choice about their community platform? Since you've probably worked with a lot of platforms, can you tell them, what's the pros and cons of running, say, a Facebook group versus, owning your own data, running a Discord group? And the second thing would be, do you want to help them establish a community guidelines? How do you create this safe space, and how do you go about handling violations? And then the third thing that I would say is maybe helping them assess risk and threat models. So by that, I mean, looking at, instances like doxing or, people exposing your identity, which is extremely core to the human rights group. So just making people aware, since mostly you'd be interacting with journalists and lawyers and people from different backgrounds, I think it's just useful to make them aware that all of this is happening, and there's probably something that you should be doing for that. So I think community managers can definitely help in those specific areas.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Most community managers, obviously, again, very contextual, depends on the community they're looking after, do a lot of work in terms of governance and moderation and risk management. And we can have quite comprehensive risk profiles and risk triage systems, again, dependent on the community. And so we really tend to bring that, we plan for those worst case scenarios, and we really cater to the unique social risks, cultural risks, and regulatory style risks within our communities. And so I think we that is part of our literacy. And so I think that spaces where we are present and doing this work do tend to be safer, healthier spaces as a consequence. And so that's also something we can potentially scale. Lauren, I'd love to hear what you have to say. I know you're also invested in that idea of that how we draw those safe spaces.
Right. And it really comes down to, and it was already mentioned before when we were talking about roles and titles, that a community manager sounds very command and control oriented. And that's not at all what it's meant to be. It's how do we, everything that was just outlined about how we create a safe space, those governance conversations, those artifacts that are anchoring the community in its practices and processes, those are dynamic documents. They are continuous conversations that are created, supported, enabled when you are of, by, and for all. Meaning, are these documents, are these conversations, is the community itself of the representation that you are aiming for? Is what you create, is that also being co-created with others? Is it created by them? Do they have a stake? Do they have investment? Do they have skin in the game? And how do we ensure that whatever is being created, it's not a one size, fits all approach, but how are you creating models in which allow a for all approach, whether it's a reframe or a repackage or different pathways? We have to be able to shed light on what those pathways are. And that's part of our role.
Yeah, fantastically put. I could not agree more. Rebecca, how can community managers be awesome allies for the human rights space?
I just want to say I get a point for unmuting this time. So I work with kids' rights and communities and online safety, and have for many, many years, but in particular, that's pretty much all that I work with. That's the age group that I work with now, all the time. And so we have a lot of things to consider. They're under 13, so there are various regulations around the world that we have to comply with, and we're happy to do that. We have to have really good tools, state-of-the-art tools to use to keep the young people safe from potential predators or harassment or bullying or all the trouble that teenagers and young teens and young people can get into without understanding what they're doing. And so I think for me, or for my group, we've been together, some of us, for 18 years. So I'm really lucky in that I have a group of people that I've been working with for so many years. And so we're sort of like a fine-tuned machine, and we've been doing it so long and working with kids so long that we have that spidey sense and really know how to deal with children, parents, teachers, law enforcement, etc. But so you have to have a plan for escalation, at least, especially if you're working in really any space, you should have an escalation plan, a what if the sky falls plan. And by design, we don't have any private chat, so that keeps our kids in a really good, safe space immediately, because that's where all the stuff that nobody wants to see or know about happens. And using really good tools and just constantly educating the kids and all the people on the team, and everybody sharing information every day. So, kids' rights are, that's I could take 3 hours talking about that. I won't. But, so, we have so much that we have to look after that's, I guess any community does, but there's just something about working with kids that you have to go an extra mile, and you have to be hyper vigilant without being in their faces and without sort of, standing over them. Nobody wants to, I always use this as a metaphor, but nobody wants to go to the skating rink with their mom, right? Or wherever people go now, and the mall or something. So, we have to sort of stand back and pay attention. And that's why good tools are so important, and experience. You can't really teach people about how a kid thinks, right? You have to have done it. You have to have looked at a gazillion lines of chat or seen a lot of interaction to do that. So from my perspective, keeping them safe with tools, keeping them safe with education among all staff, not just people who work directly with kids, whether it's a volunteer or paid positions in your site or app, and making sure that parents and teachers and stakeholders are all educated as well about how a community thinks. There's the whole culture, right? That's really hard to teach somebody, but it's really important, I think. And for kids, we have to protect them from, data mining and giving out too much personal information, which they could do without even thinking about it, just by a school uniform, right? Or something in the background, or, a picture in the background, or talking about, Kate from, New York or whatever. So that might be their username. So we have to think about usernames. We have to think about everything, and we just get a good spidey sense of it, really. And I hope that answers.
What's really interesting about what you said, Rebecca, I think a couple of things. One, I just wanted to point out, and I'm sure many of us have had this experience. Some of those things, like the school uniform tells, that happens in in communities of parents as well who are perhaps oversharing or enthusiastically sharing lives, and so it's obviously it's a different type of risk entirely when it's the young person themselves, but it spans across that. And I suppose we get to act as these sort of privacy and ethical surrogates for that community in a lot of ways, where we are looking out. We are more familiar with, certainly the legislative side of things, but also just the social and cultural harms and how they can spread and amplify. So we are very mindful of that at all times and sort of have the eagle eyes over the community. I also think that there's, it's a really interesting opportunity for community professionals who do work with young people, alongside perhaps more institutionalized cyber rights, digital health education campaigns, to really be building lived experience of those principles and protocols.
Yes.
You are really teaching and sort of helping kids understand through practice what it means to be a digital citizen, what it means to be an ethical digital citizen, what it means to be a good community member, and having exposure to those practices can be quite profound, I think. And then hopefully they might carry that through their adult lives into their other online communities.
Yes, like our whole team leads by example. And maybe we'll get into this later, but we have a model called intentional moderation, and we have to lead by example because they're young, right? And you're right about that's the thing about educating parents and teachers and law enforcement and any adult stakeholder who doesn't spend that much time with children. But parents are now like grabbing Facebook pages for their unborn children. I mean, they've been doing that for a while. So where's the right of that child, right? So how do you navigate that? So you have to be kind and you have to be understanding and understand that they just don't even understand what the implications of something like that are. And saying Susie goes to ballet every Wednesday and Friday at 3:00, and I just love it and whatever, and someplace on Facebook, and then somebody goes and looks up where the parent lives and sees that they live in Poughkeepsie, New York, and that at 3:00 they go to this place every day. They start learning, especially predators start learning. And I'm not picking on Facebook. Any place where you can share that much information, they start learning about the child or children or person and know all this information, and people don't even understand how they knew it, and they were the people who posted everything. So there is a whole education process that there's a big giant gap in the world with that, because people love having the ability to express themselves about everything in their lives because it's fun. Hey, I love it that my kid goes to dance. But how do you balance that between don't say anything? You don't want to go to there's a devil in every bush, because there's not. So yeah, it's challenging.
That's a great point. There's some really great questions from the chat, so I want to get to those momentarily. I just wanted Carrie, if you would, just to weigh in on how you think community managers can be a strategic ally for those in the human rights space, because I know that you and I have both worked. I think a number of us have worked with some of those organizations, and I think you've got some really interesting perspectives on that.
Yeah, I mean, to echo a lot of what Rebecca and everyone else has been saying, we have a responsibility to know, especially for online community managers or online community professionals, that our work can perpetuate injustice at scale because of the global nature of what we do. It can very quickly escalate into crisis. So we have a responsibility to educate ourselves about the injustices happening online. So every community, every person building online community should know about children's rights, like Rebecca's talking about, should know about, what happens when algorithms are used that are based on showing people things that are fun, are then used to perpetuate racism and misogyny and anti certain religions, things like that. So we have a deep responsibility to get educated about these things. And I hope there's community managers watching this right now and continuing to educate themselves on this. I certainly am. And I'll be sharing some resources that I've been reading and things like that. So it's a journey. So I think educating and then also advocating for those of us who work within tech organizations or work with tech organizations for more privacy and human rights focus in the technology itself. So most well, let me not say that. Many platforms, especially social media platforms today, are built to be fun, entertaining, get that dopamine hit from people. So that can very quickly spin out of control. So we need to look at what the trade-offs are there, and also what kind of world is that creating, and advocate for something that is more collective.
Yeah, fantastic. I agree. And I think many of us in this space, I think, do have that innate duty of care that we sort of have all touched on. And I think what's the next bridge, the next leap that you're describing is to, it's incumbent on us not just to know about the relevant legislation around the work that we do, which most of us tend to do, but to also ensure that we know about, the human rights principles and protocols, the key issues of the moment, where our attention could be, or our time or effort could be meaningfully applied, and if only just to recognise those issues if they present in our community. And for anyone managing a community on a social media platform, not a hosted community elsewhere, they will absolutely present in your community. There's really no way to escape them. That kind of leads me into the first question from the chat, which I thought was a great one. Certainly something we talk about a lot and deal with a lot. How do you keep community managers safe with the increase in negative content and trolls? And really strongly related to that is that, that issue of how we self-care, how we protect the social and emotional burden that comes with this work. And, and in some instances, this work is highly prized and very well compensated. Not that that's an excuse or a trade-off for enduring those harms, but at least there is, it's not necessarily precarious work. But as you said earlier, Carrie, we have the full spectrum. We have chief community officers or senior community strategists on six-figure incomes in the global north, through to those in incredibly precarious work doing, getting vicarious PTSD through, traumatic moderated content, and, living hand to mouth. It's an extraordinary range of compensation, of labour, of industry, of rights across that spectrum. And I think that there's not enough consistency yet. And across the board, we are on those front lines and dealing with these issues. So the one thing I wanted to just kick off with is, and it sort of a little bit addresses the idea around trolls and how to insulate from those behaviours. Obviously, they are quite pervasive. Something I would suggest, and we'll mention this when we speak about alternative platforms as well, is, if obviously there are great advantages to working on mainstream social media platforms, particularly around amplification and reach, which is what they do best. But there are also some really negative and harmful trade-offs. Community builders typically draw meaningful boundaries around our communities, and we ride that divide of building affinity and common interest and like-mindedness around those shared objectives and inclusion. And it's a difficult line, I find, sometimes when we want to, we know that the ties that bind and the higher the barriers to community, sometimes they can be much stronger communities as a result, but then we risk them being exclusionary. So we're constantly fighting that divide. But because of this, a lot of community professionals will choose to build and gather on communities outside of mainstream social media platforms, because they offer often better community building functionality because they're created fit for that purpose. And they do offer an extra barrier of insulation against some of those other harms. Of course, they're not immune to them. Anybody can find it and create harm if they're so inclined. But by building, especially if we're building it from scratch in these discrete, distinct spaces, we can draw those boundaries around how we bring people into the space, how we qualify them for that participation, the kind of governance and guidelines we can expose them to. We have usually more control and configurability in how we can manage that space than some of those other platforms. And we can usually make it more contextual and more relevant. So it's just one of many approaches, but I find that, going to a hosted an owned space where we have more control over the levers does allow us to draw contextual boundaries around and build the type of community culture that is right for us and appropriate for us and our needs. Whereas if that culture is happening, nested amongst a major platform, you will be subject to drive-by cultural hits and drive-by toxicity all the time. And even if you do a pretty good job of guarding against it, it is relentless, and community managers have a very hard time with personal attacks and harassment, as do their community members. So that's my seed to start the conversation. What about, why don't we kick off with you, Lauren? What do you think about how we insulate and sort of either self-care, how we protect the people who are, nurturing and being a custodian of community online?
I think we can all agree, right, that there's a certain amount of business and digital maturity and skills capabilities that we have to bring into this role. But there's a host of emotional intelligence skills that we have to apply on a day-to-day basis. And being aware of our own emotional response and knowing that there is emotional labor in all aspects of conversations, whether, we consider them difficult conversations, or, and we have to understand there's an emotional labor, a cost, a toll of connection with our community participants, even lurking costs to be able to function and interact with the community. And what I found is when managing community teams, I didn't have somebody, I broke up their day so that a new person would come into the community every couple of hours. Nobody was responsible or had the primary care of that community for an entire day or for a really long amount of time. We needed to break up that space, both for the community members as well as the community manager. So time boxing, compartmentalizing how you interact with the community, I think is important. Even if you're on your own, spend a couple of hours doing your back and forth. Take a couple of hours to work on something different before you go back in. You need to be able to step back. You've got to have that care and that calm structure for yourself as well. So I think that's incredibly important. And one thing that I brought in for my teams is and I have dealt all different types of crisis, on-site shootings, information that was leaked. I've dealt with it. And during those particular conversations or high levels of trolling and, difficult back and forth conversations, I brought in professional help or what I call empathy circles to help my group or my teams debrief. That way they do not end the job they do not end their time in facilitating that conversation without having that debriefing. The last thing you want to do is have that community manager or whoever is responsible for that conversation walk away with that guilt, that burden, whatever they're feeling. They need to be able to have a safe space in which they can get that off their chest as well. So just providing a space for your own people as well, not just the community members, but have that safe psychological space for the management.
Yeah, fantastic advice. I've adopted some similar approaches, and I love what you've described. It's great, and they do work really well. It's so important, as you say, not to let an incident or an interaction or a series of interactions be that last touch point for that human in that day or that that time period, because we once we lose visibility of them after that, it can invite other harms and other problems. I think also I'll just throw in, I think that I've certainly derived a lot of value working, as a moderator and a community manager and managing those teams as well, being in peer support communities of people that get it. Whilst you've got to balance that as well, I think, because there's a real value in sort of the sharing with the commons and the group therapy and swapping the war stories and just being able to even just check in with someone and say, this is how is this okay? Is this the right approach to this? Just sort of those check-in moments, allowing yourself that support, especially if you are doing the work alone in your organization or alone in your sort of ecosystem, finding others that do similar work in your sector or even beyond to have as those fellow practitioners that you can just kind of connect with can be a really powerful device as well. But that also shouldn't take the place, I think, of that externalizing and escape. You need to, as valuable as that is, you can't just stay in that world either, as you said. You need to get out, you need to talk to others, you need to do all the sort of standard self-care practices that we would advise anybody in this day and age. Carrie, what I know you spend a lot of time on this point as well.
Yeah, I've had many a breakdown. I will be totally honest with you. I think, and so to that end, I would just say it's okay not to be okay. Sorry, the sun is rising in Milwaukee, and that if you are doing this job well, it's almost inevitable that you will face some level of burnout. So just know that that's coming, and so that you can recognize the signs of it and quickly address it. And we need more people like Lauren, what you're talking about, leading community teams who have the capacity to hold space for people in burnout instead of just pushing them, like, go take a break and be alone. That's not the way to deal with it. We need community care as well as self-care.
In Australia, we've started rolling out training around resilience training for community managers that tries to address exactly what you're describing, Carrie. Not just, yes, a focus on the individual, but not in a way that makes it another burden they have to carry. And also you're responsible for making sure you are safe and happy and healthy. And this is also now all on you. We really stress the importance of resilient community equals a more resilient you. And so if we can get the same interconnection we strive for in our communities otherwise, from that resilience and sort of well-being perspective, we find that works really well. Shreyas, do you want to talk to that point for a moment? What are your experiences around, how do you look after yourself online, your colleagues, people that you...
Sure, yeah. I think what Lauren talked about with the community managers getting the brunt of the hate, I think that's very true, especially if you deal with gaming and, crypto communities where, and essentially like the audience is very similar, like the early adopters of technology or, people who tinker around with code are essentially the gamer set of people, and then they come on to become early adopters of crypto. And then because of some very bad projects, everything gets called a scam in the first place. So I think one of the experiences that I've had was joining a new job, and then we did like a token sale, which is essentially selling shares in the crypto industry, and then something went wrong, and I was in a totally different time zone. I was in India, so everyone was just calling us a scam and was just telling that you work for a scam company, and then personally like doxing me, finding my personal information, DMing me all of the hate. But I think there really isn't a standard set of ways in which we can deal with. Everyone deals with it in their own way. I would say that, try and figure out what interests you beyond this community. Know that it doesn't define you. This is not you. This is just a part of you, or rather part of your job. And don't try to take things personally. And if possible, like elevate people from within your community to become these leaders so that you have someone to share this experience with. I think that was primarily how I've dealt with most of the stuff that I've dealt with in the past.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful and important point about it not being too definitional. I think community building can be very passionate work and we all care a lot about it, and it's a big part of our identity, I think, safe to say. So it's actually really difficult to throw up that barrier sometimes, but I think it's incredibly important. And the more that we can encourage our community participants to work toward that self-governance state, they can take on some of that shared burden. You're right, and that's really powerful. I'd love to just address this question from the chat as well. It sort of lines up with something we were going to talk about. We were sort of wanted to touch on how the specific tactics that we use when we are building and animating and trying to build momentum in a community can be transferable to the world of the human rights space, building communities, movement building even, because there is a lot of overlap. And someone in the chat has also asked, what are some of the concrete ways that encourage relationship building in our online communities? So I thought if we could just do kind of a lightning round of some tactics, quick, obviously this is a big space. There are many books written about it, including a lovely one that Carrie's just written, and we'll share some of those resources. So we won't be able to cover everything, but what are some of your favourite sort of shorthand relationship building, get the community firing on all cylinder tactics? Let's start with you, Rebecca.
So I'd say genuine recognition of contributors in your community. I think that's really important. And I mean genuine interest. Taking an interest in anybody, offline or online, is always going to be successful for building relationships, and especially in a community of interest, which most communities are. So, and then, fostering tribes, I think, is important, because even within a community of a particular specified interest, there's going to be small groups that form out of that interest, and where people sort of, find each other. And I think paying attention to that, who's finding each other, what are their common interests, and providing, recognizing them and providing a space for them and taking an interest in sharing your various tribes. That to me would be important.
Yeah, awesome techniques. Lauren, your secret go-to playbook.
I take all of my community practices surface from urban planning principles of our physical spaces, and some of the best things can be replicated or take on a new life and manifest itself in a really awesome way in our digital communities. And I think one of those kind of big guiding principles would be, make your community walkable, meaning, ensure that you are making it easy for people to make connections with each other, make connections with the content. You need to have, a content management schedule. You have to be able to feed the beast. And that means you need to have questions, polls, different ways where people can find a way to interact, whether it's consuming, whether it's interacting with another person, whether it's interacting with a piece of content. But you give them some avenue to react, to engage, and make it easy for them to see how all of the bits of the pieces of your community fit together and how it happens over a long period of time, rather than we're just going to throw everything at you and completely overwhelm you. Make your space, make your community walkable.
I absolutely love that. One of the interesting things about what we do is it is so malleable to poaching great ideas from other disciplines. Right? We steal, deftly borrow quite a lot from social science and psychology, obviously. And that's such a beautiful example of how physical geographic communities of place can also teach us a lot about what we do. Carrie, what are some of your tricks? You don't have to give away the whole book.
I would say I get asked a lot by people about whether or not they should have one big experience for the whole community or small experiences. And you need both. You need both the large, the big content plan or the big programming plan, and you need what Charles and I call campfire experiences. So these are experiences in which you give people permission, proximity, and time to connect in a small group, ideally of less than 10. So in an online community context, that can look like a subgroup where people have a really tight shared interest, or an online event with just 10 people that's more about like a sharing circle. That is fostering those individual relationships can happen by serendipity in the large group, but typically will happen and be concretized in these really tiny experiences. That's what's really special. And there's a corollary to offline events. If you go to a giant concert, you're not going to be in community with the entire audience at that concert, but you might meet somebody while you're in line to get a beer, and you might end up making a friend that way, but you're probably not going to talk to everybody that's in the audience.
Yeah, fantastic. I love it. I love the campfire model. I think it's great. Really captures the need for the macro shared experience and shared sort of shared symbol system and all that sort of stuff, but then the tightly knit intimacy experiences. Shreyas, what are some of your favorite techniques?
I think all of the other panelists have beautifully spoken about my favorite techniques that I often copy from them. I read all of your blogs, Twitter feeds, and everything. So I think I do a lot of that. But I think it all boils down to really finding value in this contribution, right? Any contribution that someone makes, if you, especially right now in this digital age where they can do like 100 different things, they can do, they can contribute in 100 different other communities, but they still choose to do that in your community. I think be grateful for that. And once you start being grateful for that, you start from there, right? Which is when you sort of reward, recognize, engage, and all of that, all of the other things. But I think for me, I'm especially very grateful when at least one person comes in and engages with the community. So I think it starts from there.
Yeah, fantastic. I agree. You've said lots of my favorite techniques as well. I would like to throw a framework from some sociologists back in the 80s that I know a lot of us use in community management, because I think it is a sort of a framework that you can all use. And it comes from two researchers by the name of McMillan and Chavez back in 1986. most of you on the panel will know what I'm talking about. And they did some research that sort of uncovered what makes a sense of community, a sense of community being the thing that, when present, keeps people engaging in a strategic, intrinsic way over a sustained period of time. And the 4 areas they came up with were membership, so that need for that group identity, feeling part of that tribe and having totems of belonging and knowing that they're part of that group, what makes us us. Influence, so like as Shreyas was just saying, and Rebecca alluded to as well, knowing that their participation has an impact, and that impact can be quite small and contained, but I think there's so much happening and it's so loud and overwhelming, it can feel like screaming into the void. So making it clear to your participants that every interaction, even the act of lurking, as you said before, has value. Your participation in this space matters, your voice matters, and you can carry influence. Needs fulfillment, a really basic one. What are they needing out of this space? Informationally, socially, do they need an escape? Do they need to experiment with their identity a little bit? Do they need to brainstorm? Do they need to just lurk in a corner and sort of bask in the knowledge of the crowd? What do they want and need out of this space, informationally and socially? And then the last one is what's the last one? I've forgotten. Shared, I wrote it down. Shared emotional connection, of course. So creating those moments for shared joy, being vulnerable with one another, enabling self-disclosure with people really can, even if it's just small, intimate moments, builds cumulatively and really deepens that sense of community and drives a deeper engagement amongst, peer-to-peer within your community. So that's a favourite framework of mine that I return to a lot in my work. Fantastic answers, everybody. We are reaching near the end of our time. So just before we wrap up, we wanted to let you know that because we couldn't find one that existed, we have taken it upon ourselves in discussing platforms that meet criteria that is applicable to the human rights space in terms of being privacy sensitive, acknowledging that is ethically created, that is not bound by coercive or harmful business models. We've been putting together a list and running that list against the criteria and developing a way to assess these platforms that we hope to use in our work more broadly, and that we would love you to use as well. And we will endeavouring to turn that into a document and resource that you can take with you. And if you'd like to build community, and choosing a platform that meets the criteria that aligns with the work that you do is important to you, you have a starting point to make that assessment. Karen, you just want to talk to that briefly, seeing you were the one that took the lead on that?
Sure. Yeah. So, we couldn't find any list of this, and kind of bridging the human rights space with the community management space has unfortunately not really been done before, at least not in a very clear way that I've been able to find, and that any of us have been able to find. So we looked through and created criteria. There's actually 7 criteria for what it would take to be a human rights friendly software platform. And then we look at the 6 key areas of community development to consider as we evaluate community platforms. So those include governance, which is the people governance, as well as data governance, partnerships, the culture, features, and affordances of a platform, which will dictate what's possible within the space and also influence people implicitly. And then business models. So does the business model of the platform fuel things like surveillance or inequality? So I've been keeping for years now a list of all the community platforms on the market. Today there's probably over 70. I used to say it's over 60, but I think it's growing all the time. And we actually, one of our colleagues, her name is Kat Bayos, she talked to an activist in the space and ran through that list. This is just one activist, so I just want to say this is one experience. But the activist had never heard of any of the platforms. And she had shared that a lot of the people that she is working with cannot navigate complex technology. So like a really complicated, maybe say open source, you have to build it yourself kind of a platform. So this space is really open and we need technology here, but we do have a couple of recommendations and we would love to invite people to collaborate on this. But I would actually love to hear from Shreyas, Lauren, everyone else, which platforms you found in when you were looking at this, if you found any at all that you think would really fit the bill for the criteria we set out.
Yeah, I think discourse is something that I found to be very helpful, given that it sort of fits all of the criteria, which is the platform is open source. You have the ability to govern your own data and self-host it if that is your concern. But if you just want the ease of use, they also provide that with the great UI, and they have the cloud option as well for hosting, which means that you just pay them and then they'll take care of the hosting. But if data is important, which is the case with most of the groups that we work with in this audience, I think discourse might be something that you want to look into.
And of course, blockchain has been talked about quite a bit, as far as, how it can be used as a place for journalism, fact checking, truth telling, etc. And there are many different ways in which to slice and dice that. And that's one of the areas that we'll unpack in that resource document for you.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. What we would love to do, so this document's pretty well baked now. It's really pretty well developed, but it's still got a ways to go. And we would love to get your input and your collaboration on it as we turn it into a living resource that can continue to live and breathe in the world and hopefully help you in what you do. So if you would like to participate in that and join us in this work, please reach out to any of us really, but probably primarily myself or Carrie over the RightsCon platform. And we're also pretty easy to find on social media. So if you want to come to us that way, that's okay as well. If you are uncomfortable with that or unable to do that, I'm sure if you reach out to the RightsCon organisers, they can also connect us. We would really like to hear from you. And just in general, as I said at the beginning, I would really love this to be the beginning of a long-term relationship with community professionals in every industry, and all of you and all of the work that you do. We are finding ourselves increasingly called on to, sit on communities and talk about digital rights because we have a unique perspective on those, and we think we can bring value there, but we also want to really make sure we're understanding the space and, as Carrie said earlier, really aware of everything we need to be in this world and this ecosystem. We want to be doing justice if we are in a position to represent the issues out there and advocate for change. Certainly, we are definitely working to scale and build ethical communities that we hope can gradually take over the internet and save the world, as per the topic of the panel. It might take a while, but we'll get there. And so I just wanted to, if there's any final burning questions, I think we have a couple of minutes left, but otherwise I would just ask our lovely panelists if there's anything that they would like to close on, and thank them profoundly from myself and the RightsCon organisers for taking part and sharing their insights today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and love your lurkers.
Yeah, I'll echo. Thank you. And check out a couple of books, Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill, Behind the Screen by Sarah T. Roberts, Black Software by Charlton McIlwain. I'm blanking on his name right now. And The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. Those are my recommendations.
Yeah, second all of those, and The Art of Gathering, which I only read recently, is fantastic. There's a really good list of community books. I might actually go and put them up on my Twitter feed in the next hour if people want to go there, because I've failed to list them all in the time that we have left. But there's a lot. And people like Carrie and a number of our panelists have great blogs, many of whom also list and connect to those resources. So it's not hard to find the community of community managers online if you look, and we will be really happy and welcome your questions around all of this stuff. Shreyas, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Vanessa, and all of the other panelists. I think this was a very insightful conversation, and I hope that the audience listening to this conversation got some solid takeaways. And hopefully, we would like to see more of them reach out to us and build more communities.
Hear. That's a great way to end. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of RightsCon, and see you online, hopefully.